It was the most feared address in the federal prison system, and somehow, decade after decade, the most powerful crime bosses in America kept arriving at its gates. United States Penitentiary, Lewisburg, tucked into the rolling hills of central Pennsylvania, became an unofficial reunion hall for the American Mafia between the 1950s and the 1980s, housing a concentration of organized crime leadership that no other institution in the country could match. So why did the federal government keep funneling its most dangerous criminal masterminds into the same facility? And was it incompetence, strategic calculation, or something far more troubling? To understand how this happened, you have to go back to the peculiar architecture of the federal prison system in the mid-20th century. Before the Bureau of Prisons expanded dramatically in the 1980s and 1990s, the number of high-security federal penitentiaries in the United States could be counted on one hand. There was Alcatraz, sitting on its cold rock in San Francisco Bay, which closed in 1963. There was Leavenworth in Kansas, Atlanta in Georgia, Terre Haute in Indiana, and then there was Lewisburg, opened in 1932. Lewisburg was designed as a model institution, an Art Deco fortress built on farmland, with a massive central corridor stretching more than a quarter-mile long. It was intended for the most serious federal offenders, men sentenced by federal courts for crimes that crossed state lines, violated federal statutes, or involved enterprises too large for local law enforcement to handle. And in post-Prohibition America, that description fit the Mafia like a tailored suit. The story really begins with the Kefauver hearings. In 1950 and 1951, Senator Estes Kefauver of Tennessee convened a special Senate committee to investigate organized crime and interstate commerce. For the first time, Americans watched on TV as mobsters were paraded before lawmakers, some of them defiant, others nervously invoking the Fifth Amendment. The hearings revealed what law enforcement had long suspected but struggled to prove, that a sophisticated, interconnected network of Italian-American crime families controlled gambling, narcotics, labor unions, and legitimate businesses across nearly every major city in the country. The hearings were a sensation, drawing an estimated audience of 30 million viewers, and they put enormous political pressure on the federal government to act. The problem was that acting meant prosecuting, and prosecuting meant sentencing, and sentencing meant sending these men somewhere. The federal system had limited options. If you are the kind of person who wants to understand not just the headlines of organized crime, but the hidden mechanics, the infrastructure, the decisions made in back offices that shaped how power actually worked in America, then you should consider subscribing to this channel. This is a community of people who dig into the real history behind the mythology, the kind of history that rarely makes it into the movies. One click, and you will not miss what comes next. Now, the concentration of mob bosses at Lewisburg did not happen overnight, but the trickle became a flood after a single, pivotal event. The Appalachian meeting of November 14, 1957. On that day, approximately 100 Mafia leaders from across the United States, Canada, and Italy gathered at the estate of Joseph Barbara in the small town of Appalachian, New York. The meeting was intended to settle disputes, divide territories, and discuss the future of the narcotics trade. But a New York State police sergeant named Edgar Croswell had been keeping an eye on Barbara's property for years, and when he noticed an unusual number of expensive cars with out-of-state plates rolling into the rural estate, he organized a raid. What followed was one of the most surreal scenes in American crime history. Dozens of men in silk suits and polished shoes fled into the surrounding woods, stumbling through muddy fields and thorny underbrush, some of them abandoning envelopes stuffed with cash. 58 men were detained. Their identities read like a who's who of the American Mafia: Vito Genovese, Carlo Gambino, Joseph Profassi, Santos Trafficante Jr., Sam Giancana's representative, and many more. For the FBI, which under J. Edgar Hoover had stubbornly denied the existence of a national organized crime syndicate, Appalachian was an embarrassment that forced a dramatic reversal. Hoover launched the Top Hoodlum program almost immediately, ordering every FBI field office to identify and monitor the 10 most prominent mobsters in their jurisdiction. The federal prosecutions that followed Appalachian, combined with ongoing efforts by the Federal Bureau of Narcotics under Harry Anslinger, began generating a steady stream of high-profile convictions. And here is where the pipeline to Lewisburg crystallized. Vito Genovese himself, the man who had arguably orchestrated the Appalachian Summit and who controlled one of the 5 New York families, was convicted of conspiracy to violate federal narcotics laws in 1959. He was sentenced to 15 years. He was sent to the federal penitentiary in Atlanta first, but within a few years he was transferred to Lewisburg, where he would spend the remainder of his life, dying there on February 14, 1969. But Genovese was far from alone behind those walls. Consider the roster. At various points during the 1960s and 1970s, Lewisburg housed Carmine Galante, the ruthless underboss of the Bonanno family, who had been convicted on narcotics charges in 1962 and sentenced to 20 years. Galante was a man so feared that even other inmates gave him wide berth. He was known for his cold eyes, his ever-present cigar, and his willingness to use violence without hesitation. He used his time at Lewisburg to cultivate alliances, particularly with Sicilian-born inmates who would later become key players in the heroin trade. There was also John Ormento, a major narcotics trafficker connected to the Lucchese family, sentenced alongside Genovese in the same 1959 case. And there was Joseph Valachi, the low-ranking Genovese soldier whose story would change everything. Valachi arrived at Lewisburg in the early 1960s, and almost immediately his life became a nightmare. He became convinced, with good reason, that Vito Genovese had marked him for death. Genovese, paranoid and controlling even from behind bars, suspected Valachi of being an informant. Whether Genovese actually gave a formal order or whether Valachi simply perceived the threat is a matter of historical debate, but the result was the same. On June 22, 1962, Valachi, terrified and desperate, picked up a pipe in the prison yard and bludgeoned to death a man named Joseph Sopp, a fellow inmate he mistakenly believed was a hitman sent by Genovese. Sopp was, by most accounts, an innocent bystander in the wrong place at the wrong time. Facing a murder charge on top of his existing sentence, Valachi made the decision that would reshape the public understanding of organized crime in America. He agreed to cooperate with the federal government. His testimony before Senator John McClellan's subcommittee in 1963, broadcast on national television, introduced the world to the term Cosa Nostra and provided the first detailed insider account of the Mafia's structure, rituals, and rules. He described the families, the bosses, the commission, the ceremony of initiation, the code of silence. None of this would have happened if Valachi and Genovese had not been housed in the same prison. The very concentration of mob power at Lewisburg had generated the conditions for the Mafia's greatest intelligence breach. Here's a pattern interrupt worth pausing on. A declassified Bureau of Prisons memo from the 1960s, referenced in several historical analyses, acknowledged that housing organized crime figures together posed unique management challenges, including the risk of continued criminal coordination and the danger of internal mafia disputes playing out violently within institutional walls. And yet, the Bureau continued to send mob bosses to the same small collection of facilities. The reason was partly logistical, as there were simply not enough maximum security federal penitentiaries to distribute them widely, and partly jurisdictional, as sentencing judges in the eastern and southern districts of New York, where many of the prosecutions originated, designated inmates for facilities within reasonable geographic proximity. Lewisburg, located in Pennsylvania, was a natural catchment for the New York and New Jersey courts. But there was also a more cynical interpretation, one that some law enforcement officials have quietly acknowledged over the years. Keeping mob bosses together made them easier to monitor, and sometimes, as in the case of Valachi, the pressure of proximity produced informants. The 1970s brought a new wave of inmates and a new set of complications. By this time, Lewisburg had earned a reputation not just as a warehouse for mob leadership, but as a place where organized crime continued to operate in miniature. Inmates with connections to the families enjoyed privileges that ordinary prisoners did not, including access to better food, quieter cells, and a degree of protection from violence. This was not because prison administrators were corrupt, although some instances of corruption were documented. It was because the mob inmates brought with them an organizational discipline and a network of outside resources that gave them leverage within the institution. They could arrange for money to flow to guards' families. They could ensure that certain inmates were left alone. They could, and did, conduct business through coded letters, visiting room conversations, and intermediaries who carried messages to the outside world. Henry Hill, the Lucchese associate, whose story was later immortalized in the film Goodfellas, served time at Lewisburg in the early 1970s, and later described it as a kind of organized crime country club. He recalled mob figures cooking elaborate Italian meals in the prison kitchen, holding court in the yard, and settling disputes among inmates with an authority that rivaled the warden's. Paul Vario, Hill's Lucchese family mentor, was also at Lewisburg during this period, convicted of tax evasion. Hill described how Vario essentially ran his section of the prison, deciding who could sit where in the cafeteria, who received protection, and who was marked for trouble. The daily reality was surreal. Some of the most powerful criminal figures in American history, men who had controlled empires worth hundreds of millions of dollars, were living within a few hundred feet of each other, sharing meals, exchanging information, and in some cases, planning their next moves for when they got out. This raises a question that federal officials struggled with for decades. Did housing these men together actually make the Mafia stronger? The evidence suggests that in some cases, it did. Carmine Galante, during his years at Lewisburg in the 1960s, forged relationships with Sicilian inmates who would later form the backbone of the so-called Pizza Connection, one of the largest heroin trafficking networks ever dismantled by American law enforcement. The Pizza Connection case, which went to trial in 1985, revealed a pipeline that moved morphine base from Turkey through Sicily, processed it into heroin, and distributed it through a network of pizza parlors across the northeastern United States. The total volume of heroin trafficked was estimated at $1.6 billion over the course of the operation. The seeds of those relationships were planted in the exercise yard and the dining hall of a federal penitentiary in rural Pennsylvania. Galante himself was released in 1974, resumed his ruthless climb for power within the Bonanno family, and was assassinated in spectacular fashion on July 12, 1979, shot dead while eating lunch at a restaurant in Bushwick, Brooklyn, his cigar still clenched between his teeth. But the pipeline to Lewisburg also produced unintended consequences that devastated the Mafia from within. The paranoia that permeated mob life on the outside was amplified tenfold inside prison walls. Every interaction carried risk. Every friendship was potentially a setup. Every new arrival might be wearing a wire or carrying a grudge. The Valachi case had proven that the government could turn even a made man, and after Valachi, the fear of informants became a corrosive force within every family. At Lewisburg, where bosses and soldiers lived in close quarters, suspicion festered, alliances formed and broke. Men who had trusted each other on the street found reasons to doubt each other behind bars. The institution became a pressure cooker for exactly the kind of internal conflict that law enforcement hoped to exploit. Consider another ironic detail. In the late 1970s, the Bureau of Prisons finally began to grapple seriously with the problem of concentrated mob power in its facilities. A new classification system was developed to separate organized crime figures more effectively, and the opening of new high-security facilities, including the notorious Supermax prison at Marion, Illinois, which replaced Alcatraz as the toughest federal lockup, provided additional options. But even as the Bureau tried to disperse mob inmates, the gravitational pull of the legal system kept drawing them back together. The massive RICO prosecutions of the 1980s, made possible by the Racketeer, Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, that Congress had passed in 1970, but that prosecutors had been slow to fully weaponize, produced a new flood of high-profile convictions. When Rudy Giuliani, as U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, brought the commission trial in 1986, securing convictions against the bosses of 3 of the 5 families, including Anthony Fat Tony Salerno of the Genovese family, Carmine Persico of the Colombo family, and Anthony Tony Dux Corallo of the Lucchese family, the question of where to put them arose all over again. Some went to Marion, some went to Lewisburg, some went to the new federal facility at Lompoc, California, or to Springfield, Missouri. But the system still struggled to keep them apart, partly because the number of mob inmates vastly exceeded the number of high-security beds designed for their particular security profile. There is a broader structural lesson here that extends well beyond organized crime. The federal prison system in America was never designed to handle a sustained, decades-long campaign against a sophisticated criminal organization. It was built for bank robbers, bootleggers, and tax cheats. When the government decided to take on the Mafia in earnest, beginning in the late 1950s and escalating through the 1970s and 1980s, it found itself improvising, making decisions about classification, housing, and monitoring on the fly, often with unintended consequences. The concentration of mob bosses at Lewisburg was not a conspiracy. It was the predictable outcome of a system with too few facilities, too many high-profile inmates, and insufficient foresight about what happens when you put the leadership of a national criminal enterprise under the same roof. And the consequences rippled outward in ways that no one could have predicted. The relationships formed at Lewisburg and other federal prisons influenced the Mafia's evolution for decades. Men who might never have met on the outside, separated by geography and family affiliation, found themselves sharing a cell block. Cross-family alliances were born, so were cross-family hatreds. The intelligence that the government gathered from informants cultivated inside these prisons, starting with Valachi and continuing through a long line of cooperators in the 1970s and 1980s, provided the foundation for the RICO prosecutions that ultimately broke the Mafia's stranglehold on American organized crime. Without the pressure cooker of Lewisburg, it is an open question whether the government would have been able to turn as many informants as it did, or as quickly. The Supermax era brought new solutions and new problems. After the opening of ADX Florence in Colorado in 1994, the Bureau of Prisons finally had a facility specifically designed to isolate the most dangerous and influential inmates from each other and from the outside world. John Gotti, the Gambino family boss, convicted in 1992, spent his final years at the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, before it transitioned to a medium security facility, and later at the Supermax in Springfield. Sammy the Bull Gravano, the underboss who had betrayed Gotti and delivered the testimony that sealed his conviction, was kept far away, placed in witness protection facilities, and eventually re-entered the criminal world on his own disastrous terms. The scattering of mob inmates across a now much larger federal system reduced the risks of the old Lewisburg model, but it also eliminated some of the intelligence-gathering opportunities that the old model had inadvertently provided. There is one more dimension to this story that deserves attention, and it is perhaps the most unsettling. During the years when Lewisburg functioned as the unofficial capital of incarcerated organized crime, there were persistent allegations, some documented, some rumored, that intelligence agencies took advantage of the situation. The CIA's interest in organized crime figures is well established. During the early 1960s, the agency collaborated with Mafia figures, including Santos Trafficante Jr. and Sam Giancana, in plots to assassinate Fidel Castro. Some researchers have suggested that the concentration of mob leaders in federal prisons made them accessible for intelligence contacts that would have been more difficult to arrange on the outside. Declassified documents confirm that federal agencies, including the FBI and the Bureau of Narcotics, planted informants inside Lewisburg specifically to monitor mob communications. Whether the CIA did the same remains a subject of speculation, as relevant records are either classified or destroyed. But the possibility adds another layer to the question of why the government allowed, and perhaps encouraged, the gathering of mob power in a single institution. The legacy of Lewisburg as a mob-gathering place has faded in the decades since the great RICO prosecutions broke the back of traditional organized crime in America. The prison itself was redesignated and restructured over the years, with a special management unit added to handle the most disruptive inmates. The Mafia families still exist, but their power is a fraction of what it was during the era, when Vito Genovese held court from his cell and Carmine Galante plotted his heroin empire from an exercise yard in Pennsylvania. The federal prison system now has more than 120 institutions, a far cry from the handful that existed when the mob prosecution wave began in the late 1950s. The problem of concentration has been largely solved by sheer expansion, but the story of why mob bosses always ended up in the same prison is more than a logistical footnote. It is a case study in how systems designed for one purpose can produce wildly different outcomes when confronted with challenges they were never built to handle. It is a story about the limits of institutional planning, the unintended consequences of centralized control, and the way that powerful men, even when stripped of their freedom, continue to reshape the world around them. The federal government wanted to lock up the Mafia and throw away the key. Instead, it built a networking hub, a training ground, and eventually an informant factory that would help bring the whole enterprise crashing down. The bosses thought prison would be a temporary inconvenience, a cost of doing business. For some it was, for others, it was the beginning of the end, not because of the walls or the bars, but because of who was standing on the other side of them. In the end, the most dangerous thing about putting all the mob bosses in one prison was not that they could conspire together, it was that they could betray each other. The same proximity that allowed them to maintain their empires also gave them reasons to fear, to suspect, and ultimately to talk. The Mafia's code of omertà, the sacred vow of silence, was not broken by brave prosecutors or brilliant detectives alone. It was broken by the claustrophobic reality of men with too much power and too little space, locked in a building in the Pennsylvania hills, watching each other sleep, eat, and age, wondering every single day which one of them would be the next to crack.